If you are interested in moments when late-night television goes completely off script, drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. Because tonight's story is not just another awkward celebrity interview, it is about control, pride, reputation, and what happens when two powerful voices refuse to bend. What really happens when a talk show host loses control of his own stage? What happens when the guest is someone who built his career on refusing to be controlled? And what happens when millions are watching live? On a recent episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live, the energy felt different before the cameras even started rolling. The studio lights were warm, the audience was restless, and backstage whispers moved faster than the stage crew. The guest that night was Dave Chappelle, a comedian known for walking away from $50 million, for challenging entire industries, and for saying exactly what he thinks, even when it costs him. Across from him would be Jimmy Kimmel, a host who built his brand on sharp political monologues, cultural commentary, and steering conversations exactly where he wants them to go. Two men, two platforms, two very different philosophies about comedy. In recent years, Chappelle had faced waves of backlash over jokes that critics called controversial. He responded publicly, unapologetically, doubling down on artistic freedom. Meanwhile, Kimmel had transformed from prank-driven host to political commentator, frequently addressing cultural sensitivity and social responsibility on his show. On paper, it was the perfect late-night booking. High ratings, tension in the air, social media ready to dissect every word. But insiders say producers were already uneasy before the taping began. Chappelle had made it clear he did not want a lecture disguised as a conversation. Kimmel, reportedly, did not want the platform to feel like an endorsement of anything he personally disagreed with. Who was really in control? The guest who does not need the show, or the host whose name is on the building dot? The opening minutes went smoothly. Polite applause, measured smiles. Chappelle leaned back in his chair, relaxed, studying the room. Kimmel leaned forward, cards in hand, tone light but calculated. The audience laughed at safe jokes, stories about touring, a quick reference to past specials, harmless territory. But there was an undercurrent. Kimmel began steering toward the topic everyone knew was coming: the backlash, the protests, the debates about comedy crossing lines. He framed it as curiosity. He said he was asking what many viewers were thinking. It sounded harmless enough, but there was a subtle shift in his tone, less playful, more prosecutorial. Chappelle noticed he did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice. He simply stared a second longer than usual before answering. His response was calm, almost too calm, suggesting that the outrage cycle was louder than the actual jokes. He questioned who gets to decide what is off limits and whether late night hosts were now moral referees. The audience reaction was split. Some applause, some hesitation. Kimmel pressed further. He referenced responsibility. He implied that influence comes with accountability. He asked whether some material causes harm. The room tightened. Chappelle's posture changed. He leaned forward now, not defensive, focused. He reminded the audience that he had walked away from Hollywood before, when he felt manipulated. He said he understood platforms, power, and the cost of speaking freely. He hinted that sometimes the loudest critics sit behind desks, not on stages. It was subtle, but it landed. A few gasps, a few nervous laughs. Kimmel smiled, but it was thinner now. The cards in his hand were no longer guiding the conversation. Something else was. And that was the moment the temperature shifted from uncomfortable to volatile. The host decided to make it personal. The air did not crack all at once. It thinned slowly. When a host decides to pivot from policy to personality, that is when the gloves come off without anyone announcing it. The smile remains. The tone sounds curious, but the intent sharpens. Jimmy Kimmel adjusted in his chair and lowered his voice slightly, the way interviewers do when they want the audience to lean in. He stopped talking about comedy in general and started talking about Dave Chappelle specifically, not the art, the man. He brought up the $50 million walkaway from a network years ago. He suggested that Chappelle has always positioned himself as an outsider, while still cashing enormous checks from streaming platforms. It was framed as a contradiction. He wondered aloud whether rebellion becomes branding when the contracts are big enough. The audience shifted. Chappelle did not blink. He let the comment hang. Then he responded without raising his voice. He said there is a difference between leaving something that feels wrong and negotiating something that feels fair. He reminded the room that walking away cost him more than money. It cost him public ridicule and industry exile for years. Kimmel nodded, but his expression suggested he was not satisfied. He leaned further. He questioned whether some of Chappelle's more controversial jokes were less about artistic expression and more about staying provocative to stay relevant. It was the first comment that felt openly dismissive. A ripple went through the audience. That was not curiosity. That was a jab. Chappelle's smile faded, not dramatically, just enough. He asked Kimmel whether he believed audiences were too foolish to decide for themselves what to laugh at. He said comedy has always been about discomfort, about revealing hypocrisy, about challenging the powerful. Then he paused, and he asked, quietly, whether late-night hosts still challenge power, or if they have become part of it. The crowd reacted louder to that than anything so far. Kimmel's jaw tightened. He responded that his show has taken political risks, that he has called out leaders and policies directly, that he has faced backlash of his own. He suggested that commentary from behind a microphone does not make someone safe. Chappelle did not interrupt, but when Kimmel finished, he delivered the line that changed everything. He said that there is a difference between criticizing politicians and criticizing fellow artists while they are sitting next to you on your own stage. The room went still. That was not a joke. It was an accusation. Producers in the wings exchanged glances. The band members stopped smiling. The laughter had drained from the studio and been replaced by anticipation. Kimmel pushed back. He said that accountability is not criticism. He said difficult conversations are necessary. He implied that avoiding those conversations is easier when you are insulated by sold-out arenas and streaming deals. There it was. The suggestion that Chappelle was protected, detached, out of touch. For the first time, Chappelle leaned back and shook his head slowly, not angry, disappointed. He said something that cut deeper than shouting ever could. He said that insulation is pretending you are brave for asking safe questions. Approved by advertisers. A few audience members gasped. Someone clapped too early, and then stopped. Kimmel's face flushed. He tried to pivot back to humor, to lighten the tension, but the rhythm was gone. The interview had stopped being an exchange and started becoming a standoff. Chappelle was not performing anymore. He was measuring. Kimmel, perhaps realizing the audience could feel the shift, decided to regain control the only way he knew how. He reached for a prepared clip package, a segment meant to challenge Chappelle with critical headlines and protest footage, packaged neatly for television. It was supposed to be a turning point. It became gasoline. As the screen behind them lit up with protest signs and critical commentary, the studio atmosphere changed from tense to combustibly, and when the lights came back up, Chappelle was no longer leaning back, he was leaning in. When the clip package ended, the applause sign did not flash. It was not an oversight. The control room hesitated. On the screen behind them had been headlines, fragments of commentary, short clips of protests outside venues, commentators debating whether certain jokes crossed lines. The editing was tight, dramatic, scored with music that suggested urgency. It was the kind of package designed to frame a conversation before it even starts. And that was the problem. Dave Chappelle watched the footage without expression. No smile, no frown. Just stillness. When the lights came back up, he did not look at the monitor. He looked directly at Jimmy Kimmel. He asked one question. He asked whether that was journalism or theater. The audience exhaled collectively. Kimmel responded quickly, saying it was context. He said viewers deserve to see the full picture. He insisted it was fair to acknowledge the criticism. His tone remained measured, but it carried a defensiveness that had not been there earlier. Chappelle nodded slowly, then pointed out that the footage did not include sold-out arenas, standing ovations, or community outreach work he had done quietly for years. He said if the goal was context, the picture seemed selective. Kimmel countered that the controversy was the reason people were talking. He suggested that when an artist repeatedly finds himself at the center of backlash, perhaps the pattern matters more than the applause. That word repeatedly landed heavy. Chappelle's jaw tightened. He leaned forward again, elbows on his knees, posture grounded. He said something that shifted the room from debate to confrontation. He said that controversy is sometimes manufactured because outrage is profitable. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse directly, but everyone understood the implication. Outrage drives clicks. Clips drive ratings. Ratings drive revenue. For a second, the studio felt less like a stage and more like a boardroom. Kimmel tried to steer it back. He said the show was not exploiting anything. He said his responsibility was to ask hard questions. Then he added, almost offhandedly, that avoiding those questions might suggest there are no good answers. That was the first truly rude remark. It implied cowardice. It implied evasion. The audience reacted audibly. A few scattered boos, quickly drowned by nervous laughter. Chappelle did not snap. He did something worse. He smiled, but it was not warm. It was surgical. He said that answering a loaded question is like accepting a rigged bet. You lose, even if you win. He said the framing determines the verdict before the conversation begins. Then he turned slightly toward the crowd and asked them whether they felt informed or entertained by what they just watched. The applause that followed was not polite. It was loud. Kimmel's single quotes as composure flickered. He reminded the audience that this was his show. The words slipped out sharper than intended. Not shouted, but unmistakable. His show. Chappelle absorbed that. Then delivered the line that would replay across social media for days in this fictional world. He said that ownership of the stage does not equal ownership of the truth. Silence. You could hear the faint hum of studio lights. Kimmel's expression hardened. The cards were gone now. The script was irrelevant. He leaned back and said that if Chappelle felt misrepresented, he was free to clarify anything he wanted. Right there. No editing. It sounded generous. It felt like a trap. Chappelle nodded. He said he would clarify one thing. He said that comedians have always been society's mirror. Sometimes people do not like what they see, but breaking the mirror does not fix the reflection. The room erupted. Some clapped in agreement. Others remained stiff, uncertain. Kimmel attempted one more push. He suggested that mirrors can distort too, that maybe some reflections are exaggerated for shock value. There it was again. The insinuation. This time, Chappelle's response was immediate. He asked whether Kimmel believed his own monologues were free of exaggeration. He asked whether selective outrage applied equally across the board, or only to certain targets. The band looked at each other. Producers were whispering urgently off stage. This was no longer a spirited exchange. It was a live unraveling. And then Kimmel crossed a line he could not uncross. The shift was subtle at first, almost invisible. Jimmy Kimmel had built his career on timing. He knew when to let a joke breathe, when to interrupt, when to pivot. But in that moment, timing betrayed him. He leaned forward and said that sometimes walking away from criticism looks less like principle and more like ego. The word hung in the air, heavier than he expected. Ego. It was not shouted. It was not framed as an insult, but it was unmistakably personal. The audience reacted with a low murmur, the kind that spreads row by row. Ego implied vanity. It implied fragility. It suggested that the man sitting across from him could not handle dissent. Dave Chappelle did not respond immediately. He studied Kimmel's face, as if deciding whether this was still a conversation or something else entirely. When he spoke, his tone was steady. He said that ego is believing your platform gives you moral authority over someone else's art. He said that ego is assuming disagreement equals harm. Then he added, almost gently, that ego is confusing ratings with righteousness. The crowd reacted louder this time. A mix of applause and tension. Kimmel's expression tightened. He reminded Chappelle that millions of viewers trust the show. He said that influence carries responsibility. He suggested that dismissing criticism as manufactured outrage ignores real people who feel hurt. It was a fair point on the surface, but the way it was delivered felt like a lecture. Chappelle nodded once. He acknowledged that people can feel hurt. Then he asked a question that cut through the room. He asked whether the show had ever invited those same hurt communities on to speak directly, or if it was easier to debate them in edited packages. That implication landed hard. It suggested that the moral high ground was curated, not earned. Kimmel responded defensively, listing episodes, segments, political monologues. He mentioned moments where he publicly criticized leaders and policies, referencing his evolution from earlier comedic bits to more socially conscious commentary. The subtext was clear. He had grown. He had changed. Chappelle listened, then said, "Growth is admirable, but growth does not require policing someone else's journey." That was when Kimmel made the mistake. He laughed, short and sharp, and said that comparing controversial jokes to personal growth might be a stretch. A stretch. The dismissiveness in that single phrase snapped something. Chappelle straightened in his chair. His voice lowered, not louder, but firmer. He said that what is a stretch is pretending that late-night television is a neutral referee in cultural debates. He said the show benefits from conflict, from viral clips, from framing guests in ways that spark outrage. He did not accuse directly. He did not need to. The audience felt it. Kimmel pushed back harder now. He said that no one forced Chappelle to come on the show. He said that agreeing to an interview means agreeing to difficult questions. That line changed everything, because it implied consent to ambush. Chappelle's expression shifted from controlled to resolved. He said that agreeing to a conversation does not mean agreeing to a narrative. He said there is a difference between asking questions and building a case. The tension in the studio became physical. You could see it in the audience's posture, in the way some leaned forward and others folded their arms. Producers were signaling from the wings. Subtle hand gestures meant to steer the segment toward commercial break, but neither man looked away. Kimmel tried one final angle. He suggested that perhaps the backlash surrounding Chappelle's recent material was not about censorship at all, but about empathy. He implied that doubling down, instead of apologizing, reflects stubbornness. That word, stubbornness, echoed. Chappelle's response was quiet, but it sliced cleanly. He said that apologizing for jokes someone misunderstands is different from apologizing for harm you intended, and he said he had never intended harm. The audience clapped, but it was uneven, divided. And then, without raising his voice, without standing, without theatrics. Chappelle said something that left the host visibly rattled. He said that sometimes the loudest calls for accountability come from people who never risked anything themselves. The room went silent. Kimmel's face flushed deeper than before. The break music started playing earlier than scheduled, but the cameras were still rolling. The music that usually signaled relief only amplified the tension. The band played softly, uncertain, as producers debated in hushed voices behind the curtain. The red camera lights were still on. The audience knew it. The two men in the chairs knew it. Jimmy Kimmel forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. He tried to transition, mentioning an upcoming project, attempting to restore the rhythm that had defined his show for years. But the room had shifted too far. Polite applause sounded hollow. Dave Chappelle did not help him. He sat calmly, hands folded, as if waiting for something real to be said. Kimmel abandoned the transition. He turned back, leaning forward again, voice firmer now. He said that implying he never risked anything was unfair. He referenced political monologues that drew backlash, public feuds, advertiser pressure. He suggested that speaking out nightly against powerful figures is not exactly safe. Chappelle listened, then asked one question. He asked whether criticizing politicians from a network backed by corporations carried the same risk as rejecting a contract and disappearing from the spotlight for years. The audience reacted sharply. The comparison was stark. One was controlled dissent. The other was self-exile. Kimmel bristled. He said that walking away is easier when you can afford to, that not everyone has the luxury of choosing silence. There it was, the insinuation that Chappelle's defiance was cushioned by wealth. For the first time, Chappelle's composure cracked, not with anger, but with intensity. He said money does not insulate you from reputation damage. It does not protect you from being labeled, misrepresented, or reduced to headlines. He gestured toward the screen that had earlier displayed protest footage. He said that package did not show nuance. It showed a verdict. Kimmel shot back that the public forms its own verdict, that the show does not control how people react. Chappelle's response was immediate. He said the show absolutely influences how people react. Framing matters. Editing matters. Tone matters. The audience began applauding before he finished. Kimmel raised his hand slightly, attempting to quiet them. That small gesture, a host quieting applause directed at his guest, did not go unnoticed. Chappelle saw it. He leaned back and let the silence stretch. Then he delivered the line that changed the power dynamic completely. He said that if the goal tonight was to corner him, it failed, because he is not afraid of the conversation. He is afraid of conversations disguised as verdicts. The applause that followed was sustained, louder than anything earlier in the segment. Kimmel's jaw tightened visibly. He tried to interject, but the audience energy had shifted decisively. For years, he had controlled the tempo of that room. He knew exactly when to cue laughter, when to pivot to a sketch, when to soften a tense moment with humor. Tonight, that control slipped. He made one final attempt to regain authority. He said firmly that this is still his show. The sentence landed wrong. Chappelle stood up slowly, not abruptly, not theatrically, just deliberately. He looked at Kimmel and said that being a guest does not mean being a prop. The audience gasped. Some stood, others froze. Producers rushed toward the stage, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let it play. Kimmel remained seated, visibly stunned, and in that moment, the dynamic reversed completely. Because Chappelle was not storming off, he was about to finish it. When Dave Chappelle stood, it was not an exit. It was a shift in altitude. The studio lights felt harsher now, exposing every expression in the room. Jimmy Kimmel remained seated, one hand still resting on his desk, as if the furniture itself could anchor the moment back into something manageable. Chappelle did not pace. He did not gesture wildly. He simply remained standing beside his chair, composed, grounded. He said that he came on the show expecting a conversation, not a cross-examination. He acknowledged the controversy around his recent material, the headlines, the debates. He did not deny any of it, but he made it clear that being challenged is different from being framed. The audience was silent, listening. He continued, explaining that comedy has always lived at the edge of discomfort, that historically, comedians have been criticized first and understood later. He mentioned how cycles of outrage move fast, how clips travel without context, how narratives harden before full conversations happen. He did not sound defensive. He sounded reflective. Kimmel finally stood as well, perhaps realizing that remaining seated visually diminished him. The two men now faced each other on equal footing. Kimmel insisted the intent was never to ambush. He said the show had a responsibility to address public discourse. His voice was controlled, but frustration leaked through. He pointed out that avoiding difficult topics would be dishonest to viewers. Chappelle nodded once. Then he said something that silenced the tension, instead of inflaming it. He said difficult topics deserve difficult conversations. not edited montages designed to provoke reaction. He said if the goal was honesty, honesty requires risk from both sides. The word risk hung there again. Kimmel asked what risk he had not taken. Chappelle answered without hesitation. He said inviting someone on and framing them as the problem is not risk. It is strategy. Risk would be allowing the conversation to unfold without steering it toward a predetermined angle. There were no boos now, no nervous laughter, only focused attention. For the first time that night, Kimmel seemed to truly consider the criticism instead of countering it. The defensive posture softened slightly. Chappelle pressed, but not aggressively. He said that platforms like Jimmy Kimmel live shape cultural narratives. With that power comes the responsibility not just to question guests, but to question framing itself. He added that he has accepted backlash before. He has walked away before. He does not fear consequences. What he rejects is being reduced. The audience applauded, but this time it felt unified. Kimmel exhaled slowly. He admitted that perhaps the package was heavy-handed. The admission was subtle, but it shifted the energy. He maintained that criticism is valid, but conceded that presentation matters. Chappelle did not gloat. He did not smirk. Instead, he stepped slightly closer and said that disagreement is healthy, that art should be debated, but debate requires mutual respect. The words were not fiery. They were final. The producers, sensing the temperature cooling, held off on cutting away. The moment had transformed from confrontation into something more layered. Kimmel extended his hand, not as a dramatic gesture, but as acknowledgement. Chappelle looked at it for a brief second, and then he responded in a way that no one in the room expected. For a second, it looked like he might refuse. The handshake hung there between them, suspended under studio lights that had witnessed decades of rehearsed banter and controlled chaos. The audience held its breath. Then Dave Chappelle took the hand, not quickly, not reluctantly, firmly. But he did not sit back down. Instead, he turned slightly toward the audience and said something that shifted the entire narrative of the night. He said that the real issue is not whether two men disagree on a stage. The issue is whether disagreement can exist without someone being cast as the villain. There was no anger in his voice now, only clarity. Jimmy Kimmel nodded, still standing beside his desk. The defensive edge had faded. In its place was something more human, less performative. He admitted that live television magnifies tension. That sometimes in trying to ask the question, viewers are already debating. The framing can feel like prosecution. It was not a full apology, but it was recognition. Chappelle continued, explaining that controversy has followed him for years, that he understands how his words land differently in different rooms. But he refused to accept the idea that art must be pre-approved to be valid. He said growth happens in friction, not silence. The audience applauded. And this time it was not divided. Kimmel stepped forward, closing the space between them. He acknowledged that the clip package may have leaned too heavily into drama. He said that television thrives on tension, but that tension should not replace dialogue. The irony was not lost on anyone. What began as an attempt to corner a guest had evolved into a public reckoning about power, framing, and control. Chappelle finally returned to his chair, but the dynamic was different now. He was no longer the guest being questioned. He was an equal participant who had challenged the premise and won back the narrative. Kimmel asked one final question, softer than the others. He asked whether there is a line comedy should never cross. Chappelle answered simply. He said the line moves with time, with culture, with understanding, but it should be discovered through conversation, not enforced through spectacle. There were no dramatic walk-offs, no security escort, no abrupt cut to black. Instead, the segment closed with something rarer than viral outrage. Mutual respect earned. Under pressure, as the band began playing again. This time on cue, the two men exchanged a final nod. Not performative, not exaggerated, just acknowledgement. In the days that followed, clips from the episode spread across social media. Headlines framed it as a heated clash. Comment sections argued over who won. But viewers who watched the full conversation understood something deeper happened. Control was challenged, framing was exposed, and a guest refused to be reduced to a headline. If you made it to the end, you witnessed more than an argument. You witnessed a power shift. And moments like that are why live television still matters. If you are interested in conversations that go off script and reveal what is really at stake, drop a comment telling us where you are watching from, because sometimes the most unforgettable moments are the ones no one could fully script.